Good morning. My name is Julia Peyton-Jones. I am Senior Global Director at Gallery Today's ROPAC, and this morning I am absolutely delighted to be talking to Gabriele Finaldi, who has been Director of the National Gallery since August 2015. He was previously Deputy Director for Collections and Research at the Museo Nacional del Prado, Madrid, a position he took up in 2002. Prior to his role at the Prado, he was curator at the National Gallery between 1992 and 2002, where he was responsible for the later Italian paintings in the collection, Caravaggio to Canaletto, and the Spanish collection, Bermejo to Goya. Gabriele studied art history at the Courtauld Institute of Art, where he completed his doctorate in 1995 on the 17th century Spanish painter who worked in Italy, Giuseppe de Ribera. He has curated exhibitions in Britain, Spain, Italy, Belgium, and the US. He has written catalogues and scholarly articles on Velázquez, Zurbarán, Italian Baroque painting, religious iconography. Good morning, Gabriele. Thank you so much for joining me today. It's really wonderful to see you.
Hi, Julia.
I have a few questions for you over the next 40 minutes. Rumor has it that you were at school with the conceptual video and installation artist Jeremy Deller, who won the Turner Prize in 2004, which is a wonderful concept because I think of Jeremy as somebody who is anti-establishment, and you, because of your position, quite apart from any other consideration, as somebody at the very heart of the establishment. If he were to describe you at school, what would he say? Obviously brilliant, handsome, charming, funny, and what else?
It was a great pleasure to be at school with Jeremy, and we were very good friends and continued our friendship right up to the present. I suppose you'd say I was quite a serious student and quickly became very committed to history of art. He might have found me slightly out of place in Dulwich College, which is where we met. I joined the school for sixth form. It was a new experience for me, and it took me a while to kind of get used to that environment. But certainly his friendship was very helpful in those circumstances. And you know, Jeremy, he's a proper art historian. I mean, he studied at the Courtauld and so on, and so he knows what he's talking about when he talks about the history of art. And of course, you know, he has a strong sense of history and of its influence on the present. And I think a lot of his art is really about that.
Yes, indeed. And how fascinating. I think to have close relationships with artists is one of the most exciting things that any of us can have. And to count Jeremy Deller as one of your closest friends is really, you're fortunate indeed. And I believe your epiphany was at the Dulwich Picture Gallery in front of Rembrandt's Girl at the Window. What was it about the picture that you fell in love with? Or did you fall in love with examining the picture in close detail?
So I'd never studied history of art before. It was a new subject to me. It was a sort of fourth A level, so it was sort of added on. And the first class took place in the picture gallery itself. In front of this picture. Our teacher at the time was Giles Waterfield, who was the director of the picture gallery and well known to, I'm sure, to many listeners. And there was something very kind of direct and experiential about standing in front of this picture. There was the sense of an encounter with a person. There was an encounter with a creator. And those two things fascinated me. And I thought, well, this would be a lovely way to, to develop my studies. And I sort of consecrated myself to the study of the history of art and getting to know more about painting and about what art means for us today in front of that picture. So it is very important in my history, and I've been very fortunate to be able to borrow it for an exhibition in Bilbao, first of all, and then, of course, it's been shown here at the National Gallery as well.
And does it also touch on something that was later to develop, which we were talking just before we started about, you know, the importance of your family life? You know, this is a young girl at a window, you know, looking before she'd really started her life, you know, that I have a daughter, and I look at her and I think, what will her life become? How will her world unfold? Does any of that speak to you from this painting?
It does, because the way you experience art is not purely intellectual, purely historical. It impinges on your life experience, and in a sense you bring your life experience to what you see, and the way you read things, the way you understand things is deeply sort of inflected by your own life experience. I mean, when I first saw this picture, I was only 16 years old, but I did have 3 sisters. Subsequently, I've gone on to have 5 daughters, so I've certainly learned to live with young women in the house, and there is a sort of freshness and sort of directness in this young girl's gaze, and I can recognise that in some of my own daughters. Daughters tend to kind of be very affectionate towards their father, so I've always felt very, very, I've always felt in a very warm environment at home, and I was always very proud that my eldest daughters, even when they were already adults, would sort of fight with each other to sit beside me at the dinner table, and that gave me a real lift, you can imagine.
Oh, of course. That's very touching. I have 5 sisters, and my family is a family of women. The only man in the family was my father. Even the dogs were female dogs. And so and my father used to lament this. And his last children were twins. And I was by that time already in Italy studying art. And
Sure.
I remember ringing him on it was a very long time ago, on a very old-fashioned telephone, and saying, and what's happened? And he said, well, I've got twin daughters. And I found myself saying, oh no, because I knew he wanted more than anything to have a son. But the fact of the matter is, it's what a joy, and obviously how exciting that you have such a wonderful relationship with your children. That in itself.
Since we become quite personal straight away, Maria-Inés and I did have a boy, Francesco, and he was our 4th child. He, at this very moment, as we speak, his wife is giving birth in Lewisham Hospital. So possibly by the end of this interview, there'll be a grandchild there.
And this will be your 10th or 11th?
This is my 10th grandchild.
Amazing. What an achievement. Honestly, I have only the most enormous respect for you, and if I may say so, even greater respect for your wife.
Absolutely agree.
Now, the next image you asked me to include is of a Giuseppe Ribera painting. You completed your doctorate at the Courtauld on the artist. What was it about his work that held your attention for 3 to 4 years that it usually takes to write your thesis? And how does his work continue to be relevant today?
So Ribera, he's a very interesting artist, because he's an artist who's born and brought up in one place but develops his career elsewhere. And this is always very interesting, because outsiders, I think, always have a very interesting contribution to make to the environment in which they work. So Ribera was born in Valencia. He moved to Rome as a boy, probably when he was about 14 or 15. And then he moves to Naples, and that's where he spends the rest of his career. And he has a huge impact in Naples, becoming the sort of leading painter there from the sort of 1610s, really. My own family is Neapolitan. My father is from Naples, so I had a sort of feeling for the city, which is a real cultural melting pot. It's one sort of civilization built on another in Naples, but of course one of its most glorious periods is in the Baroque. Caravaggio is briefly in Naples, and then you have this glorious century of church building, of church decoration, of palaces being constructed, the relations with Spain, Ribera himself coming over to Naples. It's also a time of tremendous kind of misery, with the eruption of Mount Vesuvius in 1631, and then the Great Plague in 1656, probably the plague actually that killed Artemisia when she was in Naples. So there's this kind of magnificent contrast between the sort of glorious city and its views, its landscape, its palaces and so on, and then the sort of misery of the extent of poverty, revolution, and so on. It's a fascinating melting pot. Anyway, Ribera is right in the middle of all that. And Ribera is an artist with a very, very strong personality. He's an immensely talented artist. This was recognized from when he was a very young painter in Rome. And he paints these big subjects, big biblical subjects, mythological subjects. They have a real physical presence. You really sense that you're being sort of invited to be in the scene. So here's the Lamentation actually from the National Gallery's collection, where you can see Christ's beautiful, beautiful body being laid out before you, and you're sort of in the front row. The holy figures are on the back. There's the Magdalene, the Virgin, and St. John on the right, and you're being invited into the scene to weep and mourn in the same way that they are. So it's a very sort of participatory kind of painting. It's one that has a very strong emotional content, and it's one that has an extraordinary level of artistic skill and competence.
And also, on the face of it, it seems so simple. There are three figures, and the architecture, if I can put it like that, of the composition of the painting appears so simple, but it's incredibly sophisticated. And I think that's one of the many things that really fascinates me about works of art from history, is that how incredibly adept they are at really guiding the viewer around what they want us to look like, how they make us focus on one thing and then another, how the story unfolds. And Ribera is not an artist whose work I know as well, but this is in its simplicity, is its huge sophistication.
Yes, and I think it's also what enables the picture to speak across time. I mean, clearly as an art historian, you're very interested in trying to put a work in its historical context, trying to understand where it fits in the sequence of the artist's work, who it was made for, why it was significant at the time. But ultimately, we're interested in the picture because it says something to me now,
Yes.
Centuries later. It has to have some impact on me now, otherwise it's purely an academic exercise, whereas I think Ribera, and frankly all the great artists, find a way to project beyond their own time and impinge on our experience right now.
Yes, very much so. So the National Gallery, where you started as a curator and where you are now director, was intended for the people of Great Britain and was put together by art historical professionals in the 19th century, whereas the Prado, where you were deputy director previously, is a treasure house of the Spanish Habsburgs and Bourbons. The Prado has 8,000 pictures, plus sculpture, works on paper, decorative arts, and the National Gallery is one of the greatest museums of the world, with a collection amounting to 2,500 works. Does that mean that the size of the collection doesn't matter, and it's more about what is in the collection to define the importance?
That's a good question, actually. I joined the National Gallery in 1992. Neil McGregor, who was director at the time, appointed me to the job of curator of late Italian and Spanish painting, and he always made much of the fact that the National Gallery was different from the Prado, from the Louvre, from the Uffizi, and so on, because it was a museum set up by Act of Parliament for the people of this country, whereas those other museums were usually royal collections that had been nationalized, often as a result of revolution. Whereas here was something that was defined from the start as being a place where the public should gather for their enjoyment and also for their instruction. So that's always been a very clear sense for me of what the National Gallery is about. You're right also that the National Gallery is not a large collection. People don't realize this because when they step into the gallery, they see lots of pictures on the wall and lots of rooms to visit. But in fact, it's a rather small collection. We have about 2,400 pictures in total. We don't have anything other than those pictures. You're right, we don't have ceramics, we don't have sculpture, we don't have drawings, we don't have prints. The Prado is a different sort of museum. It's a museum that's sort of gathering up the inheritance of the Spanish royal family, the Habsburgs and the Bourbons. And of course there too, a huge number of works that were nationalized when the churches and monasteries were nationalized in the 19th century, also sort of poured into the Prado. I found it very fascinating, having been a curator here, working in the Prado, where the collections were very wide-ranging, and it was always a great thrill, personally, for me to go into the drawings cabinet and look at Goya drawings, or you know, the prints in the collection there, or to metal collection, and so the richness of those collections was a real stimulation for me, and I think it is for the public too. The experience at the National Gallery is very pure. There's a kind of rarefied atmosphere which everyone can enjoy, where you really feel as though you're walking along the peaks, you're seeing you know, the finest examples, the most representative examples. I mean, it is amazing to walk through the National Gallery and get a real sense of the very best of European painting from the 13th century right through to the early 20th century.
I know, I was in your great museum yesterday, and you know, there's a vista where you look down and you see Cézanne's bathers. I think that may be that's the sort of cut-off point. And it's just astonishing, the privilege of being able to go to a place where you can see a work of art of that caliber, but not only one, but many, many works. You walk through the galleries, and there is so much to see, and of a quality that's so outstanding. It's a feast for the eyes in a way that you can't quite comprehend. And perhaps, although of course we're in this new second lockdown, which is, you know, tragedy for all of us who love art, who want to visit museums, nevertheless, I think there's something about this period where our senses are heightened, where we're longing to see things which are going to not comfort us exactly, but speak to us. Speak to us when there's so much turmoil and uncertainty and confusion.
I agree absolutely, and I think, you know, the great museums act as, on the one hand, sort of ballast for our lives. You know, these are the things that we've all agreed are valuable and important to us. That's why we wanted to preserve them, and that's why we wanted to study them, and that's why we wanted to make access to them very easy. This is why when you have to close your doors because circumstances require it, it's tough, it's difficult. It's difficult for us to work inside these places, partly because our life is all about making them available to other people and sharing them and giving the opportunity for other people to enjoy and learn from them too. And you know, certainly as a gallery visitor myself, you know, the first lockdown period was very difficult, because I certainly find that my life is nourished, my spirit is nourished, we end up using sort of vaguely religious language, by seeing beautiful and interesting things. And you realize that while it's great to see them on screen, it's only a substitute for what I think is the real encounter. And also the experience of seeing things with other people. You know, seeing art is often a communitarian experience. It's an experience associated with friendship, with conversation, with being with the people who are close to you, with your family. And in that sense, you know, there's a lot that's very kind of pleasant and attractive about museum visiting and standing in front of great works of art.
Indeed. So can you describe the qualities in a work of art, namely perhaps painting, in the case of the National Gallery's collection, that makes a work of art great? Is there one consistent quality above all others in great works of art that raise them above all others? And if so, what would it be?
Well, that's interesting, because quality is a much disputed term nowadays.
What would you prefer to say?
I would say something that's kind of representative. Often National Gallery pictures have been selected for purchase, for acquisition, because they are representative. So they represent an artist working at the highest level. They represent a particular movement. They represent a significant moment of art history. I think the quality argument is terribly important, and it's on that basis that the National Gallery has been put together. You know, you mentioned before that it's a museum that's been put together by art historians and artists, actually, rather than, you know, kings and queens or emperors and princes. And in that sense, you know, those who have gone before us have tried very hard to acquire works that give you a sense of a narrative, some sort of continuity. Admittedly, in the early days, it might have been what I think today we consider maybe a little bit one-dimensional, which was the Bazarian narrative of going from medieval Byzantine-inspired work to a much more naturalistic style, which eventually has its culmination in Raphael and Michelangelo. And to an extent, that's the narrative that the National Gallery took on. I think it's become a much more complex and interesting narrative in our own time, where we're interested in aspects of European painting that don't necessarily feature in the standard histories or in the orthodox narrative, and that may involve looking at Scandinavian pictures, about which we frankly know very little in this country. German painting in Britain anyway, until the 1980s, I don't think was really particularly well known, and we've made some serious inroads there. We've tried to anyway. Next year we'll be borrowing a picture from Poland. Well, how much Polish art is there in this country? Very little. There's a lot of Polish people, but not much Polish art at all. So we'll be presenting Jan Matejko's famous painting of Copernicus.
Well, that's incredibly exciting to hear. Now, I'm going to move on to my next question, which is about faith. You were raised in the Catholic faith, and you said in interviews that you were bringing up your children as Catholics. In the National Gallery's collection, there are many pictorial renditions and interpretations of the Bible, and you've described how your favorite paintings vibrate with the depth and spirituality. Art is often referred to as the new religion. Do you think this is true? And if so, how is it true? And why is it true?
I think art is different from religion, but there are lots of areas of crossover. I also think that art has played an extremely important role in religion, and you only need to come to the National Gallery to see that. In a collection of about 2,400 pictures, probably about half of our paintings are of Christian subject matter. So clearly in the Western tradition, the Christian element of the iconography that we've grown up with, that we're familiar with, is it's very significant. I think that the art is often in the service of religion. Traditionally, that's what it has been. It's recounted the sort of mysteries of the faith. It's recounted stories from the Bible. It's been used catechetically to help people to understand the Christian faith and so on. So in that sense, there's a lot that I feel certainly familiar with. But I also think that, some of the ways in which artists have treated these big stories, and remember, a lot of these stories are, in a way, the sort of myths by which we understand ourselves, by which we understand what's important in society, by the way in which we understand what's important in our relations with each other. Art has been tremendously important in giving us a sense of our own humanity and our own responsibility to others. And I definitely think that that's an experience that you can come away with when you visit the National Gallery.
Yes, most certainly. I mean, I love the National Gallery. I love the staff. I love the people in the restaurant. You can tell that they care, that they love working there. When they receive you, it's like they're receiving you into their own home, which is an extraordinary achievement to invoke that passion and pride amongst your employees, particularly after the strike, which, although it was resolved before you came, must have been a little bit of a blip in the employer-employee relationship. I used to come to draw in the National Gallery, even during your busiest exhibitions, and I found this way of doing it that I would stand, like obviously in a sketchbook with no paraphernalia, but I would find a way of standing like a rock in the same place, and I would get into a sort of mindset whereby whatever else was happening around me, I was oblivious to it. And when I did that, I used to come back, day after day, and get to know the guards, get to know the people in the restaurant. Why do you think that there is such a sense of ownership for people who work with you? Because it's very rare to enlist that kind of commitment. Do you talk to them about the exhibitions? How do you make them feel it's their home?
So I think the word that you've used is very accurate, the sense of ownership. And I think that's something that's particularly characteristic of our British museums and of the National Gallery in particular. We really do feel, and I'm not just talking about the staff, I'm talking about many of our visitors, they really do feel it's their gallery. It's they own it. They're stakeholders. They have a stake in it. It's different in other museums, and having worked for many years in Spain, I know that it's certainly different at the Prado. So we've grown up with the National Gallery being part of our lives. We visited as children when we were at school. We were able to pop in briefly to have a quick look at a picture before jumping on a train at Charing Cross. So it's really become part of the way we kind of live our lives in the city. I think that's terribly important. The other thing is, I think the National Gallery has always had a very clear sense of its kind of public mission. And certainly when I joined the National Gallery in the 1990s, there was a sort of vocational aspect to working here. We were very conscious that we were serving the public and we were serving the collections. There was a kind of double service going on. And everything we did really had to kind of respond to those two obligations, to serve the collection and to serve the public. And I hope that, life has become much more complicated now, I guess, in many ways, but I hope that the sort of kernel of that sense of public service in this museum is still very present. And from what you say, you sense it when you come, which gives me a great deal of pleasure.
Yes, I really do. Now, this is one of the most famous paintings in the world, and I'm sure you asked for it to be illustrated because you want to talk about it, and I'm sure what you will say will shed new light onto my reading and my understanding and appreciation of this really wonderful work.
Well, this of course is the iconic picture of the Prado's collection. Funnily enough, the National Gallery doesn't have an iconic picture like the Mona Lisa at the Louvre or Las Meninas at the Prado, but this is a picture that's, I think, encourages endless intelligent speculation. It's a picture that that traditional definition of a mystery, which is something not that you can't understand, but something you can never quite get to the bottom of. And I think that's the case with Las Meninas. We've tried in lots of different ways to understand what it is that is being represented there, who the people are. Is there an action in the picture? Is there something actually going on that's significant? What were Velázquez's intentions? There have been lots of fascinating interpretations. I've always been very attracted by the notion that this is a picture made for the King of Spain. Remember, Velázquez was painted to the King of Spain. And he really conceives of a scene which, in a sense, for all eternity, will be viewed by the King of Spain, who, of course, appears in the mirror in the background. So the King of Spain, Philip IV, great patron of the arts and so on, and the king that Velasquez clearly wanted to please, is always standing in front of this picture, always watching this scene, always watching Velasquez at work, who of course appears there on the left-hand side. I mean, it's a miracle of representation. Velasquez is absolutely, for me anyway, the pinnacle of what painting can do, the kind of stories and the kind of ideas it can transmit. And Velasquez is the most subtle, the most brilliant, the most inventive of artists. Velasquez wrote very little. We know very little about his thoughts on art. All his thoughts on art are in his paintings, and I think they're all brought together in Las Meninas, which of course he painted just a few years before he died. So it's a summation of all his reflecting on art and on painting over the course of an entire career.
What a legacy, what an extraordinary achievement, and how fortunate we are that the world as it is, not now this minute, but in principle, that we can travel to see this work. It's reproduced, it's accessible, it's available. And then there's another wonderful painting, which is at the National Gallery, the Ingres portrait of Madame Moitassier.
Yes, just on Velasquez, now that it's difficult to travel to Spain, and once we're out of our second lockdown here, remember that Velasquez is better represented in the National Gallery than anywhere else except the Prado, and we've got a fabulous, fabulous collection which covers the entire range
Indeed.
of his production. But the picture you've thrown up on screen, I'm delighted you put up, because that's also a picture that for me personally has been quite significant. That's the first picture I remember seeing at the National Gallery, and I was brought here by my mother to see it. Now, my mother's not particularly interested in art, but she was writing up a dissertation on somebody called Charles de Foucauld. Charles de Foucauld was the scion of a sort of noble family in mid-19th century France. This lady here, Madame Moitessier, was his aunt. He lived the life of a libertine. It's a story a little bit like St. Ignatius. Anyway, he had a great crisis, and he had a great religious conversion, and then decided to live as a monk, essentially, first in the Holy Land, and then in North Africa, where he lived among the Tuareg, in the hope of making some conversions to Christianity. He only succeeded in converting one person, and then he was killed. But anyway, she had to look after his finances when he was a wastrel, when he was kind of throwing it all away on wine, women, and song. And that's why my mother was interested in this picture. So it's rather amazing, because she, of course, is the sort of grande dame of Second Empire Paris. Spectacular dress. She's posed like an ancient figure from Herculaneum, which Ang hugely admired. And
also fabulous jewellery.
Fabulous jewellery, and this amazing setting with the mirror in the background that sort of reflects her in a slightly odd way in profile. And of course, she was the aunt of this man who chose to abandon absolutely everything and live with the poorest of the poor.
Amazing, amazing painting. And then, of course, the contemporary arm, if I can put it like that, of the National Gallery is also very present, and always has been, I think. You've got a curator of contemporary art, a contemporary art program, an artist in residency, a permanent installation by Bridget Riley. You recently appointed Nalini Malini on a 2-year fellowship, which is a collaboration between the National Gallery and the Holborn Museum in Bath. However, the National Gallery begins with Cimabue and ends with Suzanne Bathers, as we've discussed. What is it about the art of today that can speak to or inform the art of the past, and vice versa?
So I would say two things on this. One is that when the National Gallery was founded, it was always the intention that it should be a place for artists to come and study and to learn. And it's continued to be that. There's no doubt about that whatsoever. Secondly, it seems to me that one of my responsibilities as the director here is to constantly find new ways to open up the understanding of the historic collection. And there are different ways of doing this, but certainly one of the ways of doing this is to ask artists to come and do it for us and to help us along, to sort of hold our hand and to show us what they find interesting and fascinating. Very often you'll find, and Ju, you'll know this, you know many more artists than I do, artists don't particularly think historically. To them it doesn't matter too much if something is from the 18th century or from the 19th century. What's important often is that it has some kind of emotional impact. There's some element to its narrative that's significant for them. And with a work like Messengers, as Bridget wanted to call this work here, she was very keen that it should be sort of preparing you as you'll make your way up the staircase into the National Gallery to see the historic collection. So she chose to call this Messengers on the basis that Constable, who's an artist that Bridget loves very much, talks about these low-lying clouds that move very rapidly across the sky and announce a change in the weather. So she wanted these to be thought of almost as if they were sort of forms moving across the sky, presaging something glorious that's about to happen, which is your access.
Of course, it's exactly what does happen.
So it's almost like a sort of baptismal font in a way, before you move into the main body of the church, let's use that language. So you come through this space and your mind is prepared and sort of purified, I guess, to have the experience of seeing the works of the great masters.
Indeed, and it is a wonderful experience, actually, all that it's transporting in a way that openness, as you describe it, and preparation. And of course, the great sadness of this current period that we're in is that we're unable to see some of the great art in this city and outside it. At the National Gallery, you've got Titian, Artemisia, and also Sin. And the acquisitions of the National Gallery are very fascinating to me. And I believe the Artemisia exhibition began with the acquisition of her self-portrait that you managed or you acquired in 2018. And these discussions developed into the extraordinary exhibition that focuses on the artist's brilliant work. How do acquisitions work at the National Gallery? And how is the curatorial program devised? Is it the result of curatorial discussions and meetings, or are you a benign dictator who crafts a program, albeit with colleagues, but nevertheless, it's very much your vision?
Well, acquisitions in particular, we think about a lot. We are one of the museums that can still acquire and acquire at a high level. We're very conscious that the gallery is pretty much full, so anything new that comes into the collection has to be significant and in a way has to kind of shift perception of the gallery, has to shift understanding. That can either be by adding excellence to excellence, so enriching a bit of the collection that's very strong already to make it even more impressive and overwhelming in some ways, or to introduce something sort of completely different and completely new. And with Artemisia, that was the case. We'd always wanted to represent Artemisia. It may be that the right work may not come up for decades, but this work did come out and we were ready for it. There are very few women artists in the National Gallery's collection. This is a historically rooted situation, but I think the public nowadays expects you to have some sort of response to this. And I think with that acquisition and with the exhibition that's currently on and will reopen after this second lockdown, we've really been able to say, well, look, it's true the National Gallery is essentially a story of men artists as the discipline has developed. But here's an opportunity for us to kind of open up the discussion. Here's an opportunity for us to do some academic work in this area. And here's the opportunity for us to show to the public the amazing achievement of Artemisia in the first half of the 17th century.
Yes, an extraordinary show. And also to have that and Titian and Sin on at the same time, what an incredible privilege. But
yeah,
I'd also like to...
I'm very fortunate in working with some very inventive curators, with some very good art historians who come up with very good ideas for exhibitions. Some I put out there myself, but many of them come from the curators themselves. And I think for me, it's a case of trying to work out the program that best represents the idea that we have of the National Gallery and what the National Gallery should be doing. And then ensuring that we have a kind of balanced program across the historical collections, working with contemporary artists, and also in more recent times, looking to see how digital innovation can help us to understand the historic collection here at the National Gallery.
Now, yes, indeed. There are so many more questions I want to ask you, but I put up for a moment this extraordinary painting by Degas. Peasant Girls Bathing in the Sea at Dusk, painted circa 1875, more or less 1876, which is it says new loan on the label, a loan from a private collection, and it is totally unexpected and absolutely so contemporary and glorious. So I wondered how much of the collection is predicated on loans of works of art. Are they important to you? Do you go around the great collections of the world and say, would you ever consider lending this to the National Gallery?
So, I mean, visitors to the gallery might actually be quite surprised if they look carefully at the labels to see that there are quite a few pictures that are on long-term loan to us. These are pictures that have come in over, potentially even over 30 years, where we felt that they would contribute significantly to enriching a particular display or a particular school, as we call them, in the gallery. I'm glad you picked this picture here by Degas. It is a completely amazing picture.
Amazing.
You said it was a work from the 1870s.
Yes.
It's
this is what your label says.
Well, sure enough.
1875, 76.
Were you shown that and you didn't know it was Degas?
I know.
You'd be forgiven for thinking it was 1910s, or indeed something much more recent. It is really
particularly if you take the two figures on the left, I think. Of today, absolutely. I wouldn't even make me miss a beat. I would just accept it absolutely. Fantastic painting.
I hope if I were shown it in a test, I'd have recognised this as a Degas, but I'd have quite readily, in the first instance, gone for a German expressionist, I don't know, Schmidt-Rottluff or something like that, or indeed thought that it was something more recent too. But I think it's loans that can often help you do things that the permanent collection doesn't. And then, I'm not talking about this picture in particular, but pictures that are on loan here, I mean, hopefully some of them in due course will end up as part of the National Collection.
No, of course. I mean, it's so incredible. Now, I have one last question. The responsibilities of public institutions have never been greater in terms of accountability to their past and to the present, in terms of their history and their diversity. How is the National Gallery addressing these challenging issues?
So there are lots of issues swirling around us, and
Indeed.
I think also, traditionally the museums are expected to take a sort of very neutral position on many of these things. I think that's becoming more and more difficult. Also, the kind of culture we live in has a kind of rapid succession of concerns, some of which build up and become terribly important. The environment, of course, is one of those. Equality, concern for the poor, issues relating to migration, the presence of ethnic minorities on the workforce or present in the gallery. So all of those are concerns that we live too as an institution. They're not just out there, they sort of come into the building too. And I think there are different ways that we can confront these things. We can do them through exhibitions. We can open up a debate within our own space. I mean, we were talking about Artemisia just a moment ago. Why aren't there more women artists represented in the National Collection? Well, that's a debate that we can open up with an exhibition like this. Why aren't there more ethnic minorities represented in the National Gallery on the workforce? Well, that's something that we need to confront, and we need to find ways of dealing with. This is, after all, a public institution. It's an institution based in London, which has an extraordinarily rich ethnic diversity, and it's appropriate that to some extent we reflect that. We do it through our programming, through what we put out, and the way in which we ask people to kind of participate in understanding the collection with us. One of the things that we've done very recently is called online, is called One Picture, Many Voices. And all of a sudden, all kinds of people who are not, let's say, experts in the history of art are commenting on National Gallery pictures. And it is fascinating. These pictures,
fantastic.
They're not ours. They belong to everyone. And we just have to find ways to ensure that everyone is somehow represented in what we do at the gallery.
Gabriele, I'm enormously grateful to you for taking the time to talk to me this morning. Thank you so very much. You've been fascinating to talk to and a great privilege for me. And I wish you and your family well, and also with the arrival of your new grandchild, a very, very happy time. Thank you again so very, very much indeed.
Thank you, Julia. It's been a pleasure. Thank you.
Well, thank you. So we have, now you can watch the previous Teas with Julia on IGTV. or our YouTube channel. For more information about our exhibitions, please visit ropac.net. Thank you for tuning in today, and I look forward to seeing you for the next Tea with Julia. Thank you.